So we finally have a new adaptation of Roald Dahl's The Witches. We had the film from 1990, and we obviously have the original novel, but now Robert Zemeckis is at the helm here. Is it good, or do they completely miss the mark? We're going to talk about it in our review of The Witches coming up.
Did you rub my lamp?
1,000 generations living in now.
Here we go.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? And welcome to FilmSpeak, where the conversation continues after the credits. If this is our first time meeting, hey, my name is Griffin. I'm an LA-based entertainment journalist and film critic, and if you want to be a part of that conversation, you're definitely in the right place. So consider subscribing to the channel for more insight, analysis, and interviews behind your favorite movies. And today on this review, I am joined by a great friend of the channel, Elliot from Movie Files. Elliot, how's it going, man?
Good, man. How we doing today, Griffin?
I'm all right. I wish we were talking about a better movie, but all things considered, I'm all right. I'm ready to dive into this adaptation. Are you?
Yeah, man. I mean, thank goodness for HBO Max, because if this was in theaters, I don't know if this would have been a good look for the cast and crew involved, but we'll definitely talk about that, man. So set in the 1960s Alabama, an orphan young boy stumbles across a conference of witches while staying with his grandmother at a hotel and gets transformed into a mouse by the Grand High Witch. This cast is surrounded by Anne Hathaway. You have Octavia Spencer and Stanley Tucci. I will say I haven't read the novel. I'm familiar with the premise. I haven't read the novel. I haven't seen the 1990s movie, which I plan on checking out just to kind of compare and contrast to see what that had versus what this offered. And I'll say that the first half, again, not having seen the film, not having read the book, I was really kind of sucked into the lore of just witches being around and introducing this kind of world building and this kind of almost very creepy, sinister vibes that was going on with Zemeckis, and Guillermo del Toro had a hand in the writing as well. So I was kind of really loving the vibes. And once we kind of transition to the second act into the hotel, and it becomes less about the lore and the mythology and less about the witches and just one witch and two kids, it just became smaller and smaller world where I was hoping to get bigger and bigger. They did the opposite of that. So overall, started off pretty interesting, but kind of the magic lost itself as the film kind of went on.
To give Zemeckis some credit, because I think it might be the only amount of credit I can give him, when it did start off, I did get that sense of, Americana Zemeckis, like stuff that we've seen from the 90s of him, in like Forrest Gump or whatever. It did have that sort of feel to it. And in fact, I'd go as far as to say that the film as a whole is very reminiscent of, the 90s family films that I don't know, I at least grew up enjoying. I'm sure you did as well. And so, yeah, I agree with you. The beginning stuff was definitely stronger. It felt like they were setting up for something. But then once they get to the hotel, you're right, it does sort of fly off the rails there, which is weird because they did do a good job of building suspense to an extent, especially in the grocery store where that one witch shows up. And she's just like offering him a piece of candy, the boy a piece of candy. She's got this really gruff voice. It's very creepy. Yes. And I was like, oh, we might be onto something here. And then for the rest of the time, they kind of lose that.
It's almost like Zemeckis got notes from the studios like, hey, Zemeckis, hey, we're loving what you're doing so far, but it's PG. So let's not go too deep into the lore. Let's keep the kids a little happy. Let's not go too deep into the scary elements, which were definitely highlighted in that first half. I mean, literally with no spoilers. I mean, Charlie's tragic beginnings and, his family and how he comes across Attica, his grandmother. And also, too, going back to the strengths of the film, mostly in the first act, that relationship between the mother, or the grandmother, I should say, and Charlie, I thought was really endearing. I found that to be very charming. I found, again, Octavia Spencer can do no wrong, except for Ma wasn't a fan of that film, but she can really do no wrong, man. She just embraces the grandmother aspect. She reminded me a lot of my grandmother, where she wasn't the traditional adult that's like believing in witches. She believed him. She, encouraged him to be who he is, have an imagination, and really kind of pick up his spirits after that tragic beginning. So I love that aspect in that relationship. But again, once we go to the hotel, it reminds me almost of Kenneth Branagh in Artemis Fowl.
It really is sort of astonishing to me how far Robert Zemeckis has fallen from grace, because, if this film was made, over 20 years ago in the 90s, I would have to imagine it would have more teeth to it.
Yes.
It wouldn't have been afraid to walk the line between being, nightmarish and yet kid-friendly, which is something I want to get to a little bit later on, specifically in terms of Roald Dahl. But, it also, I think, it would have had something to say. It would have been packed full of emotion and whatnot. And I felt like it would have been all of those things, plus the whimsical style that we know from him. But instead, it just feels like Zemeckis has been reduced to one word, and he's just now a one-trick pony, which is just, he's whimsy. That's it. That's his whole MO. It's sort of how I feel about Tim Burton. Tim Burton has just reduced himself to one word that sort of describes him, and that's just like gothic. And so it's just really disheartening, at least being a fan of a lot of their earlier works, to just see them come into a property like this and just do the superficial version of what we know them for. But getting to the story specifically, I really struggled with the interpretation of the witches. I have read the original Roald Dahl book. It's been a very long time, but I do remember it. And the 90s film is this incredibly weird thing. Like, it's kind of crazy it exists, but I'm glad that they took the risks and were ambitious with it. To me, this film completely misunderstands Roald Dahl's whole MO as a storyteller. It's like someone looked at the pictures, the illustrations in his books, and they were like, we're going to make a movie off of that rather than what the actual text is saying. And so it just completely misses the mark in that regard, because, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Roald Dahl, Dahl always resented condescending, patronizing, pandering children's stories. And so, like, the stuff that he wrote was very mature, right? He would tackle very heavy themes, like specifically, in regards to class structure. In this film, he's really dealing with mortality and life in general. And he would approach those mature things through a lens of just, like, accessibility to the audience that he was trying to tell those stories to. And that's, I think, why so many kids latched onto his material, was because they thought they were reading something that was treating them with the same respect that they wanted to get from the other adults around them. In The Witches, as I was talking about, he handles really, really heavy subject matter. He handles loss, like I mentioned, mortality, the harsh realities of life and whatnot, and he does so with such nuance. And he places it at the center of the narrative. And, even the 1990s film did that. They got the gist of what the story was about, and they weren't afraid to shy away from, like, the grim realities of life. But just unfortunately, in this telling, that notion seems to be lost on Robert Zemeckis in favor of just, wacky spectacle visuals that aren't even that good. The CGI is abysmal. And it just seems like Zemeckis isn't interested in digging much deeper than, rich people equal bad.
And I think of a couple examples of that where I thought that, again, this was a PG film and I didn't expect him to go over, certain subject matters, but I thought there was going to be, we're in the 60s and you have this black woman and her black grandson going to this hotel, and it was almost like when Stanley Tucci introduced them that he was trying to be discriminatory towards them, but they didn't go that route. And just the idea of, like, the hatred of children and what children into the world and getting rid of the children, that doesn't play much into the film at all. So it seemed like, again, I haven't read the novel, but based on your synopsis there and kind of your breakdown of it, it sounds like the framing was there, but it just, like, the studio and Zemeckis was like, we're not going to go there. Let's just play it safe. Let's just keep it kind of standard. Let's not break boundaries, which I wasn't expecting this film to be the best script of the year, but it's just like, if the material is there, push the envelope, do something new, do something a little bit more provocative, if so.
They didn't take into account the time period and focusing on a black family in this environment, going to an affluent hotel, which is overrun by these, white suburban
It looks
women.
like a plantation when they pull up to it. I'm like,
Yes, it's like it was basically if they wanted to take it in a different direction but keep the framework,
Right.
focus on the racial tensions of the time period,
Yeah.
right? Like that just especially coming off of Lovecraft country, I'm like that feels like, maybe that's the route they should have gone with that, but they don't do anything. And another thing that's like really important to the film is the grandmother's life and her previous encounter with the witch. If you've seen the original 1990 film, mild spoiler here, nothing that's going to ruin the movie, but her entanglement with the Grand High Witch, it goes back to the fact that the grandmother lost a friend. Her friend was taken from her at a young age, and she was trapped inside a painting, and she's dying. And it's this massive moment in the 90s film and in the story in general, that again sort of harps on mortality and like living your life no matter how much time you have left on the planet, and whatnot, understanding the value of life and whatnot, and that's something that comes into play when we get to the end. And I'm not going to spoil anything here, but if you are familiar with the book, the film, this version of the film is a direct translation of the original ending from the novel, which if you've seen the 90s version of it, you'll know that they did take some detours there. But this one is a direct translation of the ending from the original novel. However, it doesn't pack the emotional weight because we're just, told everything. There's just so much exposition, and we don't actually get to see these characters in an emotional state and feel it. So it doesn't have that oomph that you really want from something that's exploring these mature themes and whatnot. And so it just sort of concludes on this really bizarre whimper, for lack of a better phrase. I don't know, Elliot, if you felt the same way.
Yeah, I think it boils down to, and I'm not about bashing young kid actors because there's so much on their plate. If this is their first time getting on the big screen, it's understandable. But I think the film doesn't do those characters any justice because, to be frank, I didn't care about the beginning of the film with Charlie. I was emotionally connected, but as the film goes on, the lack of layers and the lack of character development, and we meet Bruno, who's just he's like pulled out of Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory. Like he's just a stereotypical kid with no personality at all. Yeah, and that's the problem. They should have had more kids involved, which makes me think of the lack of witchery within this film. There's literally a ton of witches that have they literally could have been just background extras at this point because none of them had anything to do in the film. So it just seems like there was just one or two characters. Stanley Tucci had some fun moments. We'll talk about Anne Hathaway and Octavia Spencer, but I feel like the kids, I just didn't care. And once the transformation happens, it's just like, okay, are we Stuart Little? Like we're just little mice. They're just running around, and he's just picking up on being a mice for the first time in his life. He's just an expert mouse, and he knows how to. I don't know. It was just they rushed. They just went through. It seemed like they just wanted to go to the end from the beginning of the movie. They just wanted to rush all the way to the end without any development.
The last thing that we do need to talk about is Anne Hathaway and Octavia Spencer. I really liked Anne Hathaway for the first couple times that she appeared, and then I kind of got over it. It became a little too overbearing and aggressive and assaulting, I guess is the best word. It just felt like every moment she was yelling. And it was like over the top in a very one-note manner. Whereas Angelica Houston in the original film was very nuanced. There was a lot more to her. There was wit and whatnot, and that is really missing here. But I will admit that I did enjoy Anne Hathaway for the large part. Octavia Spencer is great at the beginning, and then she sort of just loses her character, and it just feels like she's sort of playing a stereotypical a period piece Octavia Spencer role from that what we've seen from her before.
Yeah, I think with you, I enjoyed Anne Hathaway's performance. Not comparing this because I haven't seen the '90s film. I just found she had a lot of fun. She seemed like she was hamming it up. I will say probably my biggest complaint was that Russian accent, which the film kind of plays into you can't understand her at times, and even Stanley Tucci makes a joke about that. But it got too overwhelming where I literally couldn't understand her at points in the film with her Russian accent. But besides those moments, her as the Grand Witch, I had fun with the character. character. There is definitely some flaws within the character, like you mentioned. Over time, it gets a little overbearing and kind of redundant. But I for the most part, I enjoyed her hamming it up.
Before we give you our final verdict, guys, on The Witches, why don't you take a second here and like this video, share with your friends, and subscribe to the FilmSpeak channel where the conversation continues after the credits. And of course, we'd love to have you be a part of that conversation.
So the first half really gripped me. It actually makes me want to kind of check out the source material and also check out the 90s film. The first half is fun. It's builds some lore. Unfortunately, as the film kind of goes on, we miss the lore. We miss the character development. The story kind of becomes generic. It becomes like a video game for kids at the second half, where we're on this mission, which, by the way, the ending, where are these kids coming from? Is this a smart idea to put kids in this position? And lastly, Alan Silvestri. We talked about Zemeckis, kind of him and his, Alan Silvestri and Zemeckis work closely together. Like, I think he scored all his films. I didn't know this was the Avengers. I didn't know I was watching the Avengers film with the witches, because this was literally the same orchestra from Endgame and Infinity War, which I love Alan, but this wasn't the film for that type of score. But overall thoughts, I gave it a 2.5 out of 5, just because I did have fun with the characters, and I had fun with that first half, but unfortunately the second half doesn't do the first half any justice, unfortunately.
I think what starts off, somewhat promising, kind of a throwback to what Zemeckis does in the 90s, quickly just becomes the Zemeckis that we've known for like the past 10 or so years, and it's really disappointing. But even what's even more sort of offensive, as opposed to just like Zemeckis' fall from grace, is just the blatant misunderstanding of Roald Dahl as a storyteller and the source material you're adapting. I understand you sometimes have to make changes in order to hit a certain demographic the right way in order to make a film more accessible, but I feel like Dahl's stories was always able to hit that. It was always able to be accessible to kids and adults, and this film really just, it has very little, if anything, below the surface. Some hammy performances, some, flashy visuals, but they're not all even that great. So it's like, in the end, is it even worth it? And ultimately, I'm like not gonna remember this film. Yeah. I've almost forgotten it, basically. So it's just like, truthfully, you are just better off.
Put a spell on you, Griffin. The magic is you wiped your memory clean of this film.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're better off going back to watch the 90s film or just rereading the book or something of that nature, because this one just doesn't quite do it. And so I think for me, I'm probably going to give this one a 2.5 out of 10. Be sure to let us know down in the comment section below what you thought of The Witches, and also let us know what your favorite Roald Dahl adaptation is down there as well. I want to thank my guest Elliot for joining me today on this review. Elliot, where can everyone find you?
Hey man, it's always a pleasure talking about anything with you, whether it's things like this that aren't too great or great television shows that we've watched in the past. But thank you for having me on, Griffin. You guys can find me here at YouTube, at Movie Files, talking about the latest movies and TV shows and things of that nature. And also, if you guys want to get some of my insight on some of the movie news, casting news, directors who's directing certain films, check me out on Instagram and Twitter at Movie Files and at Movie Files Live.
The man doesn't stop, so definitely go give him a follow over there. As always, guys, you can like FilmSpeak on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, just search FilmSpeak. And if you like me specifically and you like what I have to say, you can give me a follow on Twitter at Griff Schiller. All right, guys, that is going to do it for this review of The Witches, and we will catch you next time. Take care.